What's up, everyone? I just wanted to talk about a couple of things that have been on my mind in the wake of not only the death of George Floyd and other black people, but also the continued harassment and violence against black people in America and the recent string of riots across the country. A big part of my channel has always been to try and provide some ideas and get conversations started about race issues. And I've always tried to be very thoughtful and civil when presenting these topics in a way that requires me to kind of step out of myself, because as a human being, as an American, and as a black person, these things can cause a great deal of anger and sadness. I made a video a few years ago in response to the death of Philando Castile, another black man killed by a police officer, an event that actually happened about 15 minutes away from the death of George Floyd. In that video, I questioned whether America can even be considered safe for black people to live in. In many ways, America is hostile to people of all races, especially those within the poor and working class. But this hostility is greatly multiplied for black folks. Virtually every American institution is saturated with racism, and that racism often results in violence towards black people. Police brutality is just one infuriating example of that. It's difficult to determine what black people are even supposed to do in this situation. I'm in favor of activism, fundraising, voting, and raising awareness through things like rallies, protests, and informative or creative media. I don't think that sitting at home and waiting for things to change is the correct answer. But it's often hard to figure out how effective these things actually are. Black people have been oppressed in America for centuries, and we've also been fighting and protesting for centuries. No doubt things are better for black people than they were 100 years ago, but when we continue to see things that spit in our faces, like the election of a racist president and police officers continuing to get away with killing black people, you start to wonder if you need to figure something else out. Ultimately, people with power must be the ones to change. Lawmakers have to rewrite laws, and political leaders must hold each other accountable. We can protest all we want, but ultimately the police system has to take its own actions. If they're unwilling to do these things, we either have to convince them or replace them. And it seems like we've done a pretty poor job of convincing them so far. The simplest way to replace them is, in my opinion, to show up at the polls and vote for people who have the influence and power to move things more quickly. And I hope that we continue to express our anger and discontent through our votes. But it's possible that this won't work either. It could be that we're outnumbered. Perhaps the number of people who either support or are unwilling to oppose systemic racism is greater than those who want it to be defeated. I never would have thought this about my country, but the election of Donald Trump really raises some eyebrows. Historically, if the people in power could not be convinced or replaced, rebellion was the last option. America itself was established through rebellion. African slaves rebelled against the injustice of slavery, and the institution of slavery was eventually abolished through violence. Rioting and looting is a tricky issue, however. Rioting, in my opinion, can be a legitimate form of protest. Unlike a peaceful protest, a riot is very hard to ignore. There's a fallout. There is evidence of its occurrence after it's done. I honestly have no problems with pulling down racist monuments or vandalizing a police vehicle. But I also have no problem with the city attempting to enforce the law and keep people safe. This is a natural tension that's going to happen with things like this, and any protester should be prepared to deal with it. I'm less in favor of looting stores, attacking individuals, or destroying people's livelihoods by burning down businesses, especially locally owned businesses. Now, from what I've seen throughout history, what seems to happen is that there's a demonstration or even an intense riot, but then people take advantage of the chaos by looting stores for their own personal gain or causing destruction just for the sake of doing it and not for any political message. Here in Birmingham, where I live, it's been suggested that most of the rioters were people who came in from out of town, and a significant portion of them were actually white people. We've also seen reasons to believe that outside agents might be infiltrating these demonstrations and starting riots in an attempt to discredit the movement. But I also understand that sometimes when you're angry and frustrated, you just want to tear some shit up. You want someone to be punished for the hurt that you feel. I think in such cases, you just have to remember who you're fighting against, The local sandwich shop is not your enemy. There are some people who believe that violent revolution is our only option. I'm not one of those people, but if that's what you're gonna do, don't be a coward and co-opt someone else's peaceful protest. I also want to say that the way police handle these things is often awful itself. I have seen so many videos and accounts of non-violent protesters and members of the press being assaulted by police. In fact, it seems like police are more likely to attack you when you're being peaceful than when you're participating in a violent riot. And personally, I'd like to hold the police to a higher standard than random rioters in the street, but they can be just as ridiculous. Now look, I'm not going to pretend like I have all the answers or that I know the absolute correct course of action. What I do know is they keep killing people, and disproportionately those are black people. And as of yet, I'm not seeing much progress towards making that stop. So when your community is under attack, literally by state-sponsored forces, I'm not going to blame anyone whose first instinct is to try to defend themselves in whatever way they conclude is necessary. I'm not sure what else you'd have them do. A lot of people bring up Martin Luther King Jr., who was famous for his non-violent methods of protest. He's gone down in history as one of the most significant civil rights leaders, leading people to argue that his nonviolent model is the one we should all follow. But King was one of many black figures of the civil rights era. A lot of white people talk about black history as if Martin Luther King and Harriet Tubman were the only black people in the history of America to ever accomplish anything. In fact, there have been many black political activists, many of whom criticized King and disagreed with his message. During King's time, there were leaders such as Malcolm X and Kwame Ture, who were skeptical of King's nonviolent approach. Eventually, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton founded the Black Panther Party, which advocated armed resistance and socialist revolution. They were so influential that the United States government devoted substantial resources into investigating and weakening them. And even before the era of Dr. King, leaders such as Frederick Douglass were outspoken supporters of Black rebellion. Now, these stories are very complex and nuanced, and American schools generally do a bad job of teaching Black history. But the point I'm making is it's not true that Martin Luther King Jr. did some peaceful protests and gave some speeches and then single-handedly changed everyone's minds. The progress we've seen is due to the combined efforts of Black leaders and activists throughout history, some of whom disagreed on the best path forward, but all of whom contributed towards shaping the world and making it a little better for people of color. Another thing people fail to realize is that Martin Luther King Jr. was very unpopular during his time. So whether or not something is palatable to the white masses is not a good measure of whether it is the right thing to do. King is always referenced in these situations. People who oppose violent riots like to remind us of his non-violent methods, while activists often respond by pointing out that King himself once stated that riots are the language of the unheard. Both ideas are out of context, though. For the remainder of this video, I'll share more of the words of the speech that contains that quote, because it gives context to this silly squabble about whether King would approve of the recent riots, and also because I think it is exactly the message I personally want to send at this moment. I will continue to condemn riots, and continue to say to my brothers and sisters that this is not the way, and continue to affirm that there is another way. But at the same time, it is as necessary for me to be as vigorous in condemning the conditions which cause persons to feel that they must engage in riotous activities as it is for me to condemn riots. I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so, in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. Time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation, the extreme rightists in our nation, have often used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words of the bad people and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that social progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must realize that the time is always right to do right.